If you've ever found yourself chasing a loss, or spending more time and money than you can afford on gambling, then you might have a gambling problem. In a world full of temptation, it can be difficult to maintain control. And fighting addiction can be really tough for you and your loved ones. Gamban can remove temptation by blocking your devices from accessing gambling websites and apps, wherever you are in the world. Easy to install and non-intrusive, Gamban is a helpful tool for tackling gambling addiction. Gamban can help you get back on your feet and give you the time you need to enjoy the more important things in life.
Warning, this show may be triggering for anybody experiencing gambling-related harm. Please watch cautiously. We speak from our experiences only. Please seek professional help for a gambling addiction.
Christina, and I last placed a bet in March of 2021. Welcome to the Bet-Free Life.
And I'm Brian, and I last placed a bet in July of 2014. Christina, we have been away for a little while, but we're back, and here we are recapping an episode that we already did with Dr. Smith from the Kindbridge Research Institute.
Yeah, and this has been on the books for a little bit, so I'm glad to be able to do this, and I'm so fortunate that I got to meet both these people. We both did. At the conference last week in Boston. It was great to see him in person.
Yeah, I don't think I met Dr. Wardle in person, but I did see her a lot. I did. I was standing off on the side and I could see her. So that was cool. And I knew that this was going to happen. So I was excited. Well, let's bring them both in, and then we're going to see if Dr. Wardle will give a recap about her presentation that she did at the National Conference on Problem Gambling's annual conference on gambling addiction and responsible gambling. From the University of Glasgow, Dr. Heather Wardle! From the Kindbridge Research Institute, Dr. Nathan Smith! Dr. Smith, Dr. Wardle, thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm pleased to be on this side of the pond for a few more weeks. So, yeah, it's a brilliant opportunity to come and talk to you guys.
Yeah, again, Brian, Christina, thanks for having me. Nice to be with you as always.
Well, Dr. Wardle, let's start with you. As I said, I got to catch part of your presentation, but then I got pulled out for another reason, and so I had to walk out of it, sadly. But I heard wonderful things from our friend Kitty Martz about the presentation. So I was just wondering if you could give a recap of what you talked about in your presentation at the National Conference.
Yeah, sure. So I was very much coming in to talk about our experience of liberalising gambling in the UK, which has been going on for about 15 years. And then, really interested to see what's going on in the US, because I'm sitting out in London and I'm monitoring what's going on over here, and I can see kind of parallels. I can also see missteps where, it appears to me that the US isn't perhaps learning some of the lessons that we've learned in the UK. And then also just like looking at some of the kind of the broader things that are going on. At the conference, I lost count of the amount of times responsible gambling was mentioned. And every time, for me, that has particular connotations of putting responsibility onto the individual. It's all about the individual's choice. The solutions lie in their hands. And so my presentation was very much about actually we're trying to rein that back in. We're trying to focus on what the companies are doing, what corporate practices are like, how they might influence and shape behaviors, and really kind of put, the paradigm I work from is kind of a much more kind of commercial determinants of health paradigm, which is basically the things that businesses do impact individuals, and we need to put as much attention on that, as well as thinking about individuals, thinking about their peer groups, thinking about society as a whole. So that's the kind of top level piece of what I spoke about. But actually, sort of drill down into specifics in, well, how does that actually play out in terms of lessons learned? And I walked us through a few different aspects that certainly I think in Britain have been concerning, and I think where there are particular learning points for the US. And I'd be interested to see if this is something that you see time and time again. But certainly what we see is every time we try to talk about having greater regulatory protections around gambling and the businesses and their business practices, a whole narrative emerges that says, oh, you can't impact on individual freedoms. That's something you cannot do. You can't protect these people because there are so many people who enjoy this, and 99% of people gamble and they have no problems, and it's only this 1% who are difficult. And actually, it's completely flawed logic and reasoning. And what I did was I took data that we've had from Great Britain and just stepped through why that's flawed. And the primary reason that's flawed is that given the choice in Great Britain, where everything is available to you, there are no limitations on what you can do. If you want to gamble on online slots, if you want to have in-play bets, if you want to go to your local casino, it's all there. And given that choice, actually, about half of the population choose not to gamble to start with. And then even those who do gamble, actually, most people who are doing it in a very small, very minor way, they're perhaps buying lottery tickets, or they're doing something a couple of times a year. So you quite quickly get down to the fact that actually it's a very small proportion of the population who are actually betting in a really large way, in a really major way, in a way that makes money for the industry. And when you start looking at it that way, what you realize you're doing is the freedom argument is not protecting the 99% who gamble and enjoy it, because 99% of people don't gamble, or don't gamble in a way that actually makes the industry money. What you're doing is protecting the industry's interest in that very small proportion who generate profits for them. And that was one of my kind of big points I was trying to express to people. We've got to reframe the way we look at this. And every time you hear somebody say, oh, the 99% who gamble, or the 90%, or the vast majority versus this small minority who have difficulties, we need to start calling people out on that, because that's not what the data shows. It's not also, when you start looking at the level of problems people have who take parts in particular products, which is, again, something else that I showed in the presentation. Again, that's not backed up by that evidence, because according to some of my data, actually as many as 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 people who take part in particular products are experiencing difficulties with their gambling. We've got to invert this. These would be protections that would have actually either not bother the many, or actually, enhance their freedoms, because they wouldn't be advertised to as much. It would protect you from potentially being an affected other. So that's, one of my key points is, let's break out of that narrative. In the UK, at least, we have the data and we have the evidence to be able to do so. And that was my other key learning point for the US, is that you need to have this data, you need to have this evidence, because the more that you can attack some of these erroneous narratives with evidence, the better basis you'll have to be able to kind of drive forward arguments for having the best protections that you need to protect people from gambling harms.
I hope you take this with the spirit it is intended when I say it, but I love you. Everything you said makes so much sense. How do we obtain that evidence here in the US?
Yeah, and well, this is the really difficult things. Obviously, it's funding. I mean, and Nate, in your presentation, you had a brilliant sentence, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but I did write it down, which is basically, if you don't fund it, if you don't fund research, no research happens. So you need the funding to come through. And as far as I can see, there's been, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been very limited provision for funding. Personally, I would say, you need to have independent sources of funding as much as possible. There are debates and conversations to be had about that, but that's where I would stand on this. But actually, there is quite a lot. You can piece together good evidence with, it doesn't have to necessarily be multi-million pounds worth of funding. Actually, taking small incremental steps to help build the evidence base can work, but you need a community as well to be able to work together and support each other, and not to be divided. Or I think people think academics argue a lot amongst themselves, and we do, but that doesn't mean we can't also work together for the greater good.
Yeah, can I ask a question? It's not my show, but I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, please.
So the funding piece, by way of background, Dr. Wardle was invited originally to chat about the study that we looked at previously. So if you haven't watched that episode, go back and watch that episode so you get the full picture, because we're going to kind of refer to it instead of going back over it a bunch of times. But the very first question that I had looking at that study was about funding. And then I think maybe Brian or Christina asked about, what's funding like in the UK? And I just said, I have absolutely no idea. But I can tell you in the States, so we have no federal funds in the States, basically at all. We have a small amount of funding from particular states. So my home state of Massachusetts has a few $1,000,000 a year, maybe a couple $1 million a year. And then private places, Cambridge Research Institute, for one, has $1 million, a couple $1 million at a time. And that's it. That's all we have. So I don't actually know. So my recollection, it was the Wellcome Trust, something like that. But can you just tell us more broadly about what the funding looks like in the UK?
Yeah, and this is one of the things that we're working really hard to try to change, which is, at the minute we don't have any kind of sort of certainty of funding. So we have a funding structure by which, and this probably sounds familiar to you, but the industry provides voluntary contributions to an organisation called Gamble Aware, and Gamble Aware then distribute that money for research funding. There are potential issues with that, because there's issues around perceptions of the extent of industry influence in that process. And for full disclosure, up until 2018, I took money from Gamble Aware. I don't take money from Gamble Aware anymore, and I'm not going to do so going forward, because just the issues around how that makes people think about your research and you as a researcher. And also, I'm in a really fortunate position that I don't need to take that money. But equally, I'm not going to sit here and judge people who do, because that would be deeply hypocritical. But we have that source of funding, and it's not very much. It's kind of, so far, until quite recently, it's been about 10 million a year. But most of that has gone for funding treatment, and then what's been kind of left over goes into research. But we're lucky because we have a whole range of academic funding councils or charities you can go to. So Wellcome is my main funder, and they are a large charity based in Britain. They are focused on health and health improvements. And I was really fortunate to be one of the first people that they funded to do gambling research. So, gambling is now on their agenda, which then kind of opens you up to keep going back to them to get more funding from them. And they are a brilliant funder. They're wonderful. But you also have our funding councils, which I guess would be the kind of the equivalent of your NIH type approach. Economic and Social Research Council, again, I've been funded by them recently. But the people who funded the prevalence data from which I've kind of been getting the statistics that I was talking about from, that's come from the Gambling Commission, and that comes down through central government. And they are starting to invest a bit more in gambling research. But it's been really challenging. It's like, I'm not sitting here going, oh, we're awash with funding in the UK, because we're absolutely not. There's a really small group of researchers who kind of, manage to fight and carve out and get funding from all these different sources to keep themselves going. And we would love to have ourselves a much more, certain, independent through flow of research funding, and we're trying to get it. It's not looking promising right now.
Well, thank you for all of that. I want to just really quick get to Dr. Smith and Christina and their presentations. Just a quick, how'd it go? What was it like? Nate, you presented with our friend Dave Y from the Fallen podcast regarding military members. Can you talk about that for a moment?
I was very pleased to be the first talk in the military, pathway. So there were 4 talks at the same time, right, all the way through. So I missed a bunch of things I wanted to see, and I know folks missed that. But the short version was we kind of went through some of the history of gambling research. So in the U.S., treatment for gambling basically starts in the military population in Ohio, in the Brecksville VA, in like the early 60s, like 1964, which is wild because it's, 16 years before gambling was in the DSM and 20 years before the SOGS, the Southwest Gambling Screen, which is like the first actual measure that had some sort of that had pretty strong research behind it that was gambling specific. Although I could talk about the measures for a long time, but I'm not going to, because you know how I feel about measurement. But I got the chance to talk about all of the different work that's out there, some of the prevalence problems with trying to do prevalence in a military setting, which is really kind of a nightmare because you don't really have control of what you're doing, and there's a lot of influence and other things going on. And then finally, we got to talk about 50X for Vets, which is our kind of flagship program where we're going to increase the rate of research on gambling disorder treatment in veterans by 50 times in the next 4 years. And so we kind of got to announce that, talk about some of the goals, and and Heather is correct that we can make a lot of progress with incremental work here and there, and we need to be doing that all across all of our subjects all the time. But in certain areas, it's okay to say, and here's where we make our stand with transformational change, where we're not going to do 10% a year. We're going to do 50 times in 4 years if it kills us or drives us, whatever it takes, whatever we have to do. We're going to get the money and get the funding going. So we announced all that.
What was so impressive about what he's doing is that we're setting a framework and saying, right, this is our agenda. This is what we want to achieve. This is where we want to get to with our evidence base. And as a researcher, you're like, that is brilliant, because I have now got a whole range of kind of goals and a community and people I can go to, and I can get involved, and I can see how my work fits into a bigger picture. So, I mean, the stuff that you were announcing with that program was really inspirational.
And as a researcher, a lot of the times you're like, what's the next study? And that's really important in how you have to function. But so in the States, we don't have like an NIH center that is in charge. So there's nobody sitting at the top looking at the whole body of research and saying, this is what the goal has to be for the gambling field, and they have that for alcohol and they have that for drugs and, all of the other, basically all of the other disorders in medicine, but we don't have one for gambling. And so what we're saying is we're going to fill this gap for this little piece in military where we're going to say, we're not just doing what people want to do. We're going to say this is the goal, and we're going to put all of our research towards it. And that's something that we don't have, unfortunately, because of the way the feds are set up.
Christina, would you just give a recap of your panel? Because your panel was brilliant and I loved it. And I loved what you talk about with women being presented in the media, specifically that portion of it.
Absolutely. And people watching this are wondering what's going on with my muting and my non-face. Somebody has control of my computer, but I will do the best I can and hopefully be able to stay on through this. I teamed up with the fabulous Kitty Martz, and we talked about women representing gambling harm in all different aspects, especially in the media and how the media portrays it. And so it's a lot different than what you guys were doing, as far as the research and things like that. It was just more from what I know, being 16 months in recovery, and how the work that I'm doing as far as just trying to talk about women and gambling in whatever format I can to really just let women know that there are resources, that there are help, that there are spaces specifically for women to find the help and hope and all that they need. And so it was kind of interesting too, because we talked about how media portrays women in gambling harm versus how they portray men in gambling harm. With women, there's still so much shame and stigma attached to it. And, the media really tries to keep that going, and a lot of the media stuff that I've done, especially the mainstream media. They want to know that, like, the salacious details, they want to know, and I had an editor specifically tell me, the only way this is going to get published is if you give me, the dirty details. And so I had to go back and forth and we talk about this in the presentation, like, this is what we're up against when we're trying to tell our side of things. And I wrestle with, do I want to do that? And at the end of the day, I will talk about the things that I did, not because I'm ashamed of it anymore. But because I want people to know, still at the end of the day, that there's hope and there's help, and then just the misrepresentation, like most of the main media I've done was, they doubled the amount of money I lost. They just changed details just to make it seem that much more dirty. And that's really frustrating. And so that was one of the main aspects of our presentation was just kind of how the media portrays women gambling harm, and why it's so important for women to have their own space of recovery for obvious reasons. You've got women have cycles, they've got menopause, they've got hormones, they've got these things that just are not relatable to men. And I'm looking forward to seeing these things kind of show up in future studies as well. Just how detrimental, especially menopause is for women in gambling harm.
It was a great presentation. You and Kitty crushed it and did a wonderful job.
Thank you. I was so nervous. It was my first one.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Just because I did some stuff on this years ago, looking at how media sort of reported, as you say, female gambling harms. And the thing that you notice is whenever they're talking about women, they always want to know, how many children do you have? What's your kind of position? It's always positioning you as kind of the main caregiver, and therefore anything that you've done is something somehow even more detrimental because of that, in a way that when you look at the reports on men, they never report how many children the men have got, or how many times they've not taken care of the kids. It's really, really gendered in a really, really irritatingly frustrating way. And I just kind of wondered if that was something that you'd come across as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think Kitty and I both talked about that, and neither Kitty or I have children. So, but that's one of the first questions I get asked when I'm in a media interview is like, I just recently did a news interview for New York, and it was a great interview. I thought she asked a lot of good questions, but she asked my education, which I didn't feel like was relevant, and I didn't even portray it right. I was like, I graduated high school, but I have a college education. And she asked how many children I had. And it was just like, you're right. What's the relevance? I mean, I think there is relevance in, like, as far as we're seeing women younger and younger who are battling this, and it's starting to become like a CPS problem or child protective services problem, because instead of, women spending money on drugs or whatever, they're spending money on gambling, and the same effect is still there as far as not having enough money for food, not having enough money to pay for household expenses and things like that. That's a very real problem. And so I think it's important to talk about that as far as training for those authorities to understand in that situation. And that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, I think a lot of it that's where the shame and stigma lies, is because we're supposed to be these maternal caregivers. We're supposed to be the ones that rear the children and do all these things. And for us to have something like this, it's shameful. Mm-hmm. How could we be putting ourselves above everybody else? Yeah. That's where the stigma is. How can you be so selfish? But for a man, and I'm not saying that everybody is like this, but for a man, it's like, I kind of get it. The woman's at home taking care of things, right? That's kind of where it is. And it's, you're right.
You kind of like, because you basically want to make sure that, whoever they're talking to, they're asking the same, because I think it's fine to say, well, what's the impact been on your family? But make sure you ask that of men as well as women. And when you're doing the focus, it's not just, the narrative is nearly always the impact of women on their family. And with men, it's the impact of them on their productivity and their employment.
Right. And I think with men, it kind of tends to be like where they're at in life, right? Like with men, it's always kind of the conversation, kind of like a midlife thing, or maybe they're not as successful enough, or those are the kind of the questions that I see a lot when you're talking to a man that's struggled with gambling addiction and harm. But for women, it's just like, it's just a completely different narrative. And I know we're kind of like time crunched, but I think there's a difference too between men and women. When a woman shares her story, there's a lot of times, oh, that's so brave of you. It's so courageous of you to share your story. It's not courageous. I want to share my story. I'm not ashamed anymore. But for me, words always have different meanings. But for me, when somebody says I'm brave for sharing my story, but they don't say that to a man, it's still implying that there should still be shame, that I should still be embarrassed to be talking about the things that I did while gambling. And a lot of times, and there's never 100%, right? A lot of times it's not said to a man who shares their story of gambling harm. And so that's another narrative I wanted to address. So with that said, I'll let Brian move us into the next phase.
No, thank you for all that. It's a great discussion and we should talk about it more. But we are on that time crunch. I know everybody has places to be, so we want to make sure that we get to the episode that we previously discussed on, which was called Gambling Addiction and Research Explained. And Dr. Smith was with us on there, and we went over a study, which I will let him talk about now. And we'll move from there with Dr. Wardle, who actually did the study.
Yeah, I thought it was a good episode. I thought I was good on it, right?
It has higher views than the ones around it. So I think other people thought it was a good episode too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's good to know. So the idea was, we always have this discussion, Brian and I, and Christina and I have had it separately about, it's sort of hard to understand, like, how do you look at a study if you're not used to looking at studies, right? If it's your first time, or, everybody says, well, we have to, look at the best evidence. I say that. But then it's like, if you don't have the training in it, then, where do you start? How do you do that? What's the way that that's done? So what we did is we walked through, and I highly encourage folks to watch it because we want to get as many views as possible, right? So go watch it, put it on in the background while you're taking a shower, walking the dog, whatever you got to do, get those views up, makes us feel good. But the idea was that we would walk through the study, and we did. But as we went through, we actually came up with a number of questions and a number of things, some of it UK based and some of it we just didn't know the answer to. And also it's like we publicly critiqued Dr. Wardle's study. So it's like fair play to, give her the opportunity to come on and chat about it and answer some of the questions and point out what we got wrong, or, what we didn't consider, or anything else. I think that's fair play. Maybe I think it'd be interesting, maybe Heather, if you start with the background. So this was a study about suicide, suicidal behavior. So that's sort of the background. And maybe you could talk about kind of where it came from and how it fits and how it got going.
There's that paper, and there's also another paper which is very similar. It takes the same approach and does that analysis, but for all adults. So the one that you focused on was for young people aged 16 to 24. And the background to this is that in the UK, we've started to have much more conversations around the impact of gambling harms on mental health, and including suicidality. And there's been a really strong lived experience network developed, who are typically the parents of young men who have died by suicide related to their gambling. And they have been incredibly powerful in moving the agenda forward and recognizing, the severity of harms that are associated with gambling, and then calling for action. And that's been going on since around 2015, 2016. And you kind of, so being in that world, you're talking with these people, you're trying to figure out how you can support people. And they called out, like, why has there been no research on this? And just basically, to be honest, as a gambling researcher in the UK, I felt hugely embarrassed that it took bereaved parents saying, why are you not looking at this, to kickstart the research community in the UK to actually start doing something about it. And that's, it is shameful, and I'm not going to particularly make any excuses for that. It wasn't on the agenda. People weren't really talking about it. People weren't really looking at it. So given the opportunity to do something, and again, this is kind of links back to that kind of, well, where's your incremental gains? There were a couple of studies where we could add a couple of suicide questions. So looking at suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts, and start to generate some of this analysis. So we did that, particularly with this emerging adults survey that I was running. And that study was focused, it's looking at young people and the impact of changing technology. So it's got lots of questions about loot boxes, about social media, about all the different types of gambling that you might do. And then I had a tiny bit of questionnaire space left where I added 2 or 3 questions about suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, and a couple of kind of additional ones around loneliness and so on. But I didn't have the full questionnaire space to really go to town on this. It was literally like, here is a small window of opportunity to try and do something. So we added those questions, did the analysis, and then the result was the paper that you guys talked about.
I think it's good for folks to know that is typical of how it works when you're looking. In order to get a large sample, you're usually trying to fit stuff in. So when I did my dissertation, my mentor said, you have 2 questions. I said, I want to put my gambling piece in. And she said, great, you have 2 questions.
Yeah.
So I gave her 5 questions to put in, and she came back with 3. So, we negotiated it out. But this is just the way it works, is that, we generally don't have the money to do large scale gambling specific studies across a huge population. So we're just trying to get whatever we can in. So that's useful. Brian and Christina, did you want to jump in there, or should I keep going?
I know that we're going to get to the portion that I think was our biggest question about depression, if I recall. I'm sure we're going to get to that, but that's what was on my mind about that.
Yeah. So just to catch everyone up who hasn't gone back and watched the video, go watch the video. The biggest question we had, so there are a few little bits that we'll talk about, like education in the UK, which I don't understand. It's all Harry Potter to me. I'm going to use the jokes from the previous video too, just so you know.
It's been long enough that you can do that.
It's been long enough. So my apologies if you watch it back to back. And then race, which is another thing which is really interesting in the UK, which I don't know. Race and ethnicity in the States, we do a particular way. I don't really understand it in the UK. I'd like to talk about that too, but I guess, we won't bury the lead. So for me, I really liked everything about it. I think it was probably the best study done on the subject that I've ever seen, period. The one thing that I didn't understand and was a big question to me was the depression link, because so whenever you have something that is a third factor that can be linked to both the exposure and the outcome, right? So depression could be linked to gambling. We certainly know there's a relationship there. Depression can be linked to suicidal behavior. Obviously, we know there's a strong link there. Whenever there's a third thing like that, it's called a confounder. We think it can maybe get in the way of understanding the relationship properly. And so that was really, for me, that was the big, the big criticism, the big question from the study was there was no actual measure of depression, although we might have gotten a preview in the previous answer of why that wasn't in there. But have you watched the video, right? So however you want to respond or how you thought about it, or, your limitations, we're interested in that.
You're right. So we didn't have the space to have every measurement of every possible confounder in there that we would want. And depression is a big one that is missing. And I particularly liked your bit when you were walking through the paper and you're like, oh, here comes the limitations. Is depression specifically mentioned? And I think I slightly buried it in a obscure way, saying, oh, there might be other mental health issues. And you were right. I should have been way more explicit there and said, no, depression isn't measured. It should be measured. It could explain this. And it was simply, as you say, part of this kind of like when you're trying to shoehorn a couple of questions in, we just didn't have the space to include everything. And also there were, because the study's designed to measure multiple outcomes, it wasn't just looking at suicidality, it's looking at kind of the relationship between kind of gambling behaviors, gaming behaviors, digital behaviors as well. Some of the other things like impulsivity, for example, I took the decision to be kind of more important to include because they would speak to kind of all aspects of what the study's trying to achieve. That's on me. That was my call. And I have to put my hands up to it. What I will say as kind of context for this is the second paper that we did, where we looked at the relationship between suicide attempts and problematic gambling. amongst all adults in the population. We did have measures of depression in that study, which we used in our models. And what we found was when we did that, yes, it mediated the relationship a bit, but it didn't explain it fully. So in that paper, we can say there is still a strong and significant association between suicide attempts and problematic gambling, even when you take into account depression, anxiety, other common mental health disorders. That one also had substance abuse in there. It had ADHD in there as well. So it had a broader range of mental health issues. So that kind of makes me feel a bit better that, we've now got a second study that we did do a fuller range of controls on, and we still found that relationship. So even though you're right, and I think it should be in there, so going forward, if you were to do it again, you would have a much broader range of controls to look at this. My gut feel would be that it wouldn't account for the relationship in its entirety, that relationship would still be there.
Yeah, there's a lot of important bits there. I mean, first off, something can be the best study on a subject and also have obvious flaws, right? Like all of these things can be true. And the impulsivity piece is important too, because impulsivity, links to gambling and then also linked to suicidal behavior, right? So that's another one. It's going to be impossible to include every possible thing. ADHD would be another thing. We could probably sit, if we wanted to, and come up with 25 other potential confounders. But no, I appreciate taking a perspective on that. Brian, Christina, how are you thinking about that?
When you say a broader range of controls, what does that do to the overall study? See, this is why we have you guys on, to explain this in simpler terms to us. Do you want even more controls? I mean, having even more controls, does that get the study to a better number, to a better result, I should say?
So when I talk about controls, basically you have to map this back to what this actually means for your questionnaire. So when you talk about controls, what you're talking about is essentially survey questions that you ask of people to generate data. And often, like something like depression, to get something with a reasonable accuracy of depression, you might have to ask 7 or 8 different questions that are asking people to give information about the kind of different types of experiences that they have. Then that you then condense down into, often it's a number or it's a binary variable that said, yes, someone has probable depression or not probable depression. And then that ends up being the thing that you put into your analysis to then see what impact that has on the thing that you're interested in, which in this case is problem gambling and suicide attempts. So it kind of it's quite useful to map it that way, because you can then go back to see this whole conversation about, you're really limited for how much questionnaire space you've got. So in my questionnaire, I only had 10 minutes of survey space funded. So if I was going over the 10 minutes, I had to cut questions out. So and normally you work on a kind of average of, you can ask 4 survey questions in a minute. So if I've got 8 questions to measure depression, that's taking up quite a big bulk of my survey space. And therefore you have to make quite harsh decisions about what's going in and what's coming out. So that's kind of the design side element. In terms of the analysis, I mean, you want to be able, as Nathan says, I mean, in an ideal world, you want to sit down, you kind of want to map, well, this is what I think is happening between these two things, and what are all the possible things that could explain this. Depression, impulsivity, low well-being. It could be adverse childhood experiences. It could be a whole range of things. And in an ideal world, you want to have some sort of measure of those, so that even when you've taken those into account, if the relationship persists, you can say, actually, there is something else going on here between gambling behavior and suicide attempts that can't be explained by all these other things. The problem is, from a kind of statistical perspective, is that often in our surveys, we actually have a relatively low number of people experiencing problematic gambling. And that makes these models, if you throw too many things at these models, if you basically take the whole book and throw it at it, the model will just fall over because you just haven't got enough people to be able to get it to run. So you then have to make quite careful decisions about what's going in, what's coming out. And then the really tricky bit is really in the space of the 3,000 words you're given by your journal is really explaining and justifying to people the decisions that you've made. And it's really hard. And some of it is as much of an art as it is a science. And I think, you have to approach it in that way, that, there are a whole load of different decisions that you make that start from what you put in the questionnaire that go right down to what you're putting in your analysis and then how you're treating that. And trying to describe to people why you've done what you've done all the way through can be quite difficult. But that's why it's really important that you try to be as transparent as possible. If people, have questions, like you had questions, I wanted to come on and have a discussion with you about it and say, I absolutely agree. It's not perfect. There are always different decisions that we could have made, but let's be open about it. And also, actually, in an ideal world, you want to share your data so that other people can go in and double check what you've done and make sure that you haven't done something stupid. Or that they can say, actually, I have a different idea about looking at this. We could look at it this way. Does that relationship still hold? And that's really, really important. And I think, sometimes people, perhaps worry about doing that, but I never do. I'm always like, the data's open. If you want it, you can have it. And please, it's there as a resource. There's a limit to how much analysis I can do. The more people looking at this, the better.
When you release a study like this and then it's done, you're done with it, do you get feedback? Do you get people like Dr. Smith reaching out and asking questions? Do you get feedback from the media? Do you find that people are reading these studies and then coming back to you?
Occasionally, but not in the way that you guys did. The way that that was why I was so, as soon as you emailed me and said, oh, we've done this, I was like, brilliant, I want to watch it, I want to engage with you, because my experience has been that I haven't had at that level of engagement before in a piece of research that I've done. You occasionally get people sort of asking little questions or queries, but not that often. People they keep things to themselves, I find. Maybe that's just me. I don't know what your experience has been, Nathan.
Yeah, no, you don't usually, to get an email to say, hey, we did a 90-minute bit where we broke down your study like line by line, like in a public format. And by the way, it's out there. It's got to be a weird one to receive. I've not yet received that one. But I would say, you do have to say, Heather, you've taken it really well as far as just being really, really open, which I appreciate, because as I was writing that email, I was like, this could go really badly if the person who I'm writing to is not, doesn't take the same sort of view of open science and open discussion, that I think is actually true science. I think is open science. The open science movement is complicated. We're not going to talk about it. It certainly has its flaws and its misuses, but I think in general, true science is open science. And I was really hopeful as I was writing that email that it wasn't going to be I wasn't going to just get a string of expletives and a take that down or some other legal thing. So you got to give a lot of credit to Dr. Wardle and her collaborators on how they've dealt with this.
Yeah, when you came back to us, Nate, and you said, I'm reaching out to her, I was a little. I also thought,
nervous.
This could go poorly.
No, I was just going to say, I just think anyone who reacts like that is a bit daft. Because if they react like that, then I don't think they really understand the volatility of some of the analysis and the way that research is actually working. And I think you need to, if you're sure, if you're sure enough in what you're doing, you can kind of talk about what you're doing and accept that there is uncertainty in what you've done. Yeah,
I agree. And that's why I felt good. I felt good reaching out because I was like, I think this is going to be fine. But also then we probably both know folks who, would not have gone well with. So both people exist in the world. But if you're going to really break down somebody's work in a public setting, you have to reach out and say like, hey, and please, we would love your full response, in the same open public setting. Like that has to be, if you're willing, I'm kind of, you put your work out there publicly, I put my analysis out there publicly. If either of us got something horribly wrong, like let's talk about it publicly, because this is, science is done by people, which I think is something that gets forgotten when you look at it and it's in the pretty journal and it's written out and it has all the bits, but it's like, no, it's just a person who, like, you probably heard my son bopping around downstairs. Like, it's a person doing the best they can in a hot room in Maine with like a 2-year-old running around. Like, this is really what's happening. It's not secret or special. That's what I like try and say a lot. Like, there's no secret and it's not special. It's just, a really hard job that we try and do as best we can and mess it up all the time.
And can I just say that what's so important about having these conversations on a format like this or a platform like this is that those of us every day who are struggling with this, right, who are overcoming gambling addiction, who are trying to understand it ourselves, stuff like this is, I'm going to be completely honest, a little over my head. When you have wonderful people like you who we know that's in the background trying to figure this out, trying to do things that are going to help us combat problem gambling, disordered gambling, that gives me a sense of peace, knowing that out there's somebody out there trying to help us understand it, to help us understand the whys of it, because that's one of the biggest questions that I see a lot. I never really struggled with the why. I was just more curious with the how am I going to get through this? But there are a lot of people who struggle with the why. Why can't I do this normally? What is so wrong with me that I can't do this normally? And that is a huge question in the gambling harm community. And so to know that people are out there trying to figure it out for us, trying to understand it better themselves, that's huge. That's huge. And to be able to watch it be broke down and kind of the understanding of it, that's a big deal. And I can't thank you both enough for what you do and for being able to come on here and talk to us about it.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, just to say, I mean, thank you for the opportunity. And this is what makes us better. Because, as I said, it was through engagement with Lib community that, made me go, okay, actually, I've got an opportunity to do something here and then give something back. And then hopefully, so the more we do stuff like this and the more that we work together, the more hopefully we can kind of elevate our knowledge and understanding and actually make improvements for people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this is the part of the show where I say, if you want to help us work on this or think about it, you can email me at nathan@kindbridgeinstitute.org, nathan@kindbridgeinstitute.org. And you can be part of this conversation. We have a lived experience advisory board and a scientific advisory board. And the idea is we need to get everybody talking together to do better. And so email me if you are interested in this and would like to.
I was thankful to be a part of a study that's coming out. And I know I probably can't say much about it, but it was a really interesting experience for me. It was a great experience for me. And so if that's something you're thinking about, that you want to be part of a study, you want to talk about your experience, definitely reach out to Nate and Heather and see what you can do and offer your experience and your thoughts. Yeah. That's it. I'm done.
I was just going to say, I also want to thank you both because I think breaking down these studies, I think more so than ever, people with lived experience want to know what's going on, what's being done. And it's just nice to know, like Christina said, people are working on this stuff. That it's not just their voices aren't just going out into the wide open air. They're being heard. And that's a really good feeling. So thank you both for being here and for doing this. Dr. Wardle, what are you working on now? Is there a study that you're working on now?
Well, actually, I'm doing a follow-up to the study that you reviewed because I now have longitudinal data because we followed the people up a year later. So now I'm looking to see the relationship between your change in your problematic gambling status and how that's then related to subsequent suicide attempts. So I'm halfway through the analysis on that. And actually, I'm just thinking about this. It may well be really useful to use you guys as a sounding board for early drafts of that paper so that next time when you can, basically, if you're going to go line by line through it, I've done that process before it's even made it into the public domain. That might be a really good way forward.
That would be great. I mean,
we're
we'll
here
definitely
for that.
Need Dr. Smith to help us go through because it's so helpful to have somebody walk you through what you're reading, what you're looking at. Because if you said, here, read this study, I'm going to glance and eventually I'll find the summary and I'll read the summary, but I'm not going to understand where the data came from, why the data is what it is. And to have Dr. Smith be able to walk us and everybody who watched it through that, I thought was great. And I'm so glad that it was your study, Dr. Wardle, because who knew that you were going to be at NCPG and give such a great presentation? And who knew that you were going to be this awesome? So it's great that it brought all of us together. And I know Christina and myself will probably reach out to you separately to see if you would be on our podcasts, because that's another avenue that we do that we've done longer than this. And I'm sure we would love to have longer conversations with you. So that would be much appreciated if we could reach out to you in the future.
Sure. Sounds great.
And Dr. Smith, are you working on anything right? You're working on the what you talked about during your presentation, correct?
Yeah, we've got the military things are ramping up. We've got a couple other things we're going to announce at some point, not now, but maybe when that time comes. We're going to have some interesting things coming out on the overlap of military and gambling, and also, there's a serious suicidality piece also with that with U.S. military veterans, which is something we're interested in and starting to work on an approach for. But we'll leave that for another day.
And Christina, any final thoughts?
No, I'm just so thankful to have this conversation. It was amazing. It went really smooth, and I'm just really appreciative again of the work that you guys are doing. It's nice knowing that for every industry person out there trying to figure out how to get us in, there's people out there who's trying to figure out how to get us best help, and that to me is priceless. So,
amen. Well, for Dr. Wardle and Dr. Smith, who are enjoying their vacations, and for Christina, who's probably frustrated about her computer, but nonetheless will kick butt in this episode, and we didn't even notice because I can edit all that out. I'm Brian. Thank you for watching.
Talking helps.